Hello and welcome. I'm Shani Pierre. I'm the director of the Columbia Maison Française, and I'm delighted to present today with the Alliance program this conversation between Benjamin Stora and Emmanuel Kattan. This discussion is going to be taking place in French, but we're providing simultaneous translation in the lovely voice of Nicholas Elliott. So if you would like to listen in English, you can click on the globe on the bottom right corner of your screen and choose English. Okay. It's also going to be recorded in both languages and will be posted on our website. En français donc, je vous souhaite à tous.
In French, welcome to all of you to this conversation with Benjamin Stora and Emmanuel Kattan around Benjamin Stora's report commissioned by Emmanuel Macron on questions of commemoration of the Algerian War of Independence. Before we start, I want to say that the Maison Française and the French department recognize the demands of the students currently striking at Columbia. It seemed important to us, however, to maintain this event with Benjamin Stora around this report that has led to so much debate in France, in Algeria, and internationally, since this is the first time that he has the opportunity to talk about it with an American audience. But we do want to show our respect for the strike, and in the chat and our website, you can read more about this strike. Benjamin Stora will be introduced in a moment by the person speaking with him today, Emmanuel Kattan, who is my colleague at Columbia. He directs the Alliance Club and is also the author of several books, including Thinking About the Duty of Memory. I want to thank Mr. Stora for taking the time to speaking with us today, and to thank Emmanuel Kattan and the Alliance program to having proposed and participating in this meeting. We will have about 20 minutes for audience questions at the end. So if you have questions, you can put it in the Q&A in French or in English. And I hope that Mr. Stora will have the time to answer your questions. Thank you all for being here. I will now let Emmanuel speak. Thank you very much, Shani. Thank you infinitely. We are delighted and honored to welcome in Benjamin Stora, one of the great world experts on the history of Algeria. Born in Constantine, Benjamin Stora is a university professor. He teaches the history of contemporary Maghreb, the decolonization wars, and the history of immigration from the Maghreb in Europe at University Paris 13 and the Institute for Oriental Languages and Civilization. He has published some 40 books, including a biography of Messali Hajj, Gangrene and Forgetting, a book about the memory of the War of Algeria, Appelé en guerre d'Algérie, Algeria, the Invisible War, and the three Jewish exiles of Algiers, which was shortlisted for the Renaudot Prize. Last year, Benjamin Stora was commissioned by the President of the Republic for a mission regarding the memory of the colonization and the War of Algeria, to reconcile the French and Algerian people. Benjamin Stora turned in this report to President Macron on January 20th. This report has some 30 recommendations. There has been a great deal of interest in it in the media in France, Algeria, and around the world. It has also led to a great deal of debate. The work will be translated into Arabic and into English. We are particularly honored because it is the first time that Benjamin Stora is presenting his report in the United States. Benjamin Stora, you have said regarding the relationship between Algeria and France that the memories are still bleeding. Why, after close to 60 years, after so many novels, films, studies, why does this history still remain problematic? Does it mean that the work of memory has not been done? Good evening. Here in France, it's 5:30 p.m. And thank you to Columbia University for inviting me via the new means of technology, since without moving in space, I can have a dialogue with you. And it is, of course, of great interest to me of being able to address an academic public, notably an American one. To answer your question, I would say that indeed, the work of historians has considerably moved forward regarding the history of the Algerian War of Independence and colonial history. There is a great historiographic tradition in France, which was continued by Charles Robert Agent. One mentioned the work of Gilbert Beignet, Rodé Galissot, Claude Yozu, Jean-Charles Geoffrey. I could go on and on with the list of French historians who have worked a great deal and who have cleared this territory of colonization and the Algerian War, and on the Algerian side, and they have considerably moved forward. There's the great work of Medarbi, a great Algerian historian who has produced many volumes that have helped me a great deal, in fact, when I worked on the history of Algerian nationalism. Mohamed Arbi, who wrote about the FLN and the archives of the Algerian Revolution, which is a considerable work with a great deal of archival content. One must also talk about the great Algerian historian Afud Kadash, who has since passed on, but who did tremendous work on the history of Algerian nationalism. So I can't say all the names here, though I do try to make an inventory, biographical one, of the major works of historians in my report. And there's a new generation of historians that has appeared in the last 20 years. Didier Saï, Sylvie Thénault, Raphaël Branche. And on the Algerian side, Mohamed Amer, a great historian. In short, I could say many names. Hassan Emaroun, who is a friend and who I've been working with for many years. The historian's work has shifted considerably. It has developed considerably. But indeed, despite this historical work, which is considerable, the memories are bleeding. Why? It's a very important question, this kind of disconnect between the production of academic knowledge and historical knowledge and the state of societies that continue to feel underrepresented. In other words, that they're not listened to. I think that on the French side, this question is due to the fact that for a very long time, France did not want to look at the history of contemporary Algeria after independence straight on, after 1962. It did not want to look at it because this loss of French Algeria was a crisis of French nationalism, insofar as Algeria was not like Morocco or Senegal or Indochina. Algeria were French departments integrated in the French nation. And when a nationalism has been built separately and opposed French nationalism, then the loss of French Algeria was cruelly felt as a kind of thorn planted in the heart of French nationalism. So from there, we had to forget, try to think about something else, move on to other histories, build Europe, etc. So for about 30 years, until the 1990s, it seemed that Algeria and the French consciousness had become a kind of forgotten territory. And then this history could not be forgotten. It could not be forgotten despite the fact that the French state had organized this forgetting through what is called the Amnesty Laws. There were 4 amnesty laws in France, which were voted in this period of the 60s to the 80s, that forbade any trial or judgment on people who committed acts of violence, notably during the Algerian War. So these successive amnesties built a collective amnesia. And this history of colonization was not taught in high schools. It was not taught in universities. I remember in the 1970s, when I started to work with Charles Robert Ageron, who was my mentor, I was one of the very few French students to do a thesis on Algeria in the 70s. There were practically no doctorates at that time. That's to say that the cultural desert that existed around that question. And I'll mention in passing that that's what reinforced my excitement as a researcher, was to be so alone, to find myself as a kind of scout in this territory. But nonetheless, this loneliness, this solitude is heavy. So consequently, when the memory came back, it came largely because citizens mobilized themselves, and not simply through historians' work. This mobilization, which was of a political character, the children of immigrants wanted to know why in French society a racism had been perpetuated toward them. And they made a link between the colonial question experienced by their parents. I'm talking about the 80s and the 90s. It is that colonial racism, and of course, the history that was their own, that forced them to break through the memorial blockage. For instance, the commemoration of 1961, when massacres of Algerian workers took place. There were also the children of Harki who were demonstrating because they had been marked for many years of, they wanted to know what exactly had happened in this history. And one must also add, of course, the children of soldiers, the children of auxiliary soldiers, draftees, the great groups. One can say this political, citizen, democratic mobilization, a desire for history, this kind of desire for history, that is what progressively touched the institutional field and the political field. And that's when, specifically after these mobilizations, that's when the political authorities started to move. And in 1999, for the first time in France, the National Assembly voted the principle of war in Algeria. This was absolutely incredible. Until that moment, the war in Algeria did not exist on a legal juridical level. So, for instance, draftees could not have the card of veterans. They could not have a pension because it did not exist. It was a non-war, a war without a name, as the filmmaker who just died, Bertrand Tavernier, said, who in fact, 1992, made a film called The War Without a Name about this. So in 1999, there was this vote. There was also the memory that returned following these mobilizations of slavery through mobilization and the Tauberin law of 2001 that defined slavery as a crime against humanity. From there, there was a whole series of taking of positions by politicians, the speech by Jacques Chirac in Madagascar. There had been massacres in Madagascar. Chirac recognized these. There were speeches by heads of state, Nicholas Sarkozy and Constantine in 2008, François Hollande in Algiers in 2012. So this memory came back both from below, from down below, the citizens' mobilization, and of course, intellectual mobilization, and journalistic mobilization, because it is through journalists' investigations, for example, like Le Monde, Florence Bourget, the journalist, revealed the crimes committed by the crimes against Larbi Menji, the great leaders of Algerian nationalism. So there were also investigations, not just historians' work, also journalistic investigation that must be saluted, that reinforce things. So we arrived at a situation, we came out of forgetting, the coming out of forgetting was very strong, but time lost was strong. Half a century of time lost. So this lateness meant that memories had been scattered. Narratives of this war were not transmitted, passed down officially through commemorations, through political positions. It is memory that is passed down through family intimacy, memories that have been passed down that way. So each group is going to want to build its own memory. There was no commemorative closeness within French society. Each group wanted to be right in the past. That was the big thing, to say that everyone was ultimately saying that they were right, and no one wanted to recognize that they could be criticized on any level in regards to this colonial past or any responsibility. Each group was locked into a narrative that was its own narrative and that was passed down by families. And so there's a scattering of memory and a return that came in a scattered, disorderly way, and that led indeed to this kind of competition, this war, we could say, of memories. We insisted in French society, that we witnessed in French society in the 90s. When the President of the Republic asked me for this report, knowing that I had worked a great deal on this aspect of things for 45 years, it's been 45 years that I've been working on this history since I started in 1974 with Raymond and Jean-Pierre Rioux. So it hasn't been a recent thing. I've written some 40 books, films, etc. So he asked me to work quickly to make this report, which was not, let's say, a report with a historian's commission, but a personal subjective report, what I personally thought of this situation. Because he had read my work in Gangrene and Forgetting, my work in general. So he asked me to do a very quick report, a kind of synthesis, a synthetic document. And to tell the truth, I hadn't measured the impact that you signaled earlier. I just thought it was a document to set things straight, to assess things, a synthesis of what had been done and what could be done. It was not a classic work of writing history, because I've done that a lot, the history of Algeria, colonial Algeria, etc. I've written these narratives. No, the challenge for me was rather not to continue to write history, but to make history, to advance in history. At my age, I'm 70, I told myself, ultimately, why not face up to this challenge? That is to say, not just be satisfied with observing history by writing it, but who tries from a personal experience to make history move forward and progress without measuring the impact, the public impact that this work would have, because it seemed to be just a synthetic assessment. But if we have time to talk about its reception, I was quite surprised by its huge media and political and intellectual reception around this work, which is ultimately a modest piece of work. It's not the biggest work that I've written in my life, let's say. I've written others. It was a report to assess and set things straight regarding the dispersion of memory, the wars, the repression that could exist, and to try to find bridges without any illusions, because I know that there are separate histories, separate memories, but try nonetheless to try to propose things that could help to move history forward. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's a glimpse of the memory of the Algerian War and the relationship between France and Algeria that you've given that's fascinating. I'm asking myself precisely the extraordinary reception of this report may be due to the expectations that were built up over the years of silence and the divergencies between French and Algerian memories. I'd like to go to the heart of the subject and talk about some of the major aspects of the report, because actually the major interest of this report is that it proposes and recommends concrete actions. Perhaps we could start by what you propose in the field of archives. There is a recommendation that seems very interesting to me. You recommend, in fact, encouraging access to archives in France by Algerian researchers by facilitating the giving of visas. I think this is an interesting approach because it is very practical. It aims to create these bridges that you speak of between researchers. I want to ask you about the status of archives to begin. Where are we? There are some administrative archives that have already been opened, but what does your report recommend in terms of archives that are considered secret due to national defense reasons and that are now 50 years old and should normally be open to researchers? Maybe you could also talk about us to your own approach to archives. Have you consulted them? I'm sure you've consulted many of them, but are there some that you have not yet consulted? And are you expecting that these archives reveal aspects of this history that you do not know? First, you're right to speak about practical terms, because unfortunately in the relationship between France and Algeria, there are always these questions of ideological and memorial arguments. Later we'll talk about specific things like cemeteries that disappeared. These are things that lead us down paths that are not ideological, like old ideological quarrels that we would repeat from old times, but that must allow us to truly move forward. That's my objective. Which is not to say that we're not to follow the classic work of documenting, archiving, writing history, but that was not my objective. My objective was to find paths, and you've mentioned the path of archives. The archives, of course, I've looked at many of them for all my books. I've looked at the archives a great deal. I've looked at the ones that are in Aix-en-Provence. In Aix, there are kilometers of archives. You know, when France left Algeria, it brought all of French Algeria. So you can imagine what that means from a legal perspective. France brought with it tons of archives that covered many years. The repatriation of archives started before independence. It started in 1961. Archives started to leave for France, and that continued until 1963, 1964. Many, many archives. So in Aix-en-Provence, there are many things, enormously large amount of things that can be consulted. I have personally consulted the surveillance archives of quote unquote indigenous people that touch on the massacres in 1955. There are many things on that. I've looked at the surveillance records of the FLN during the Algerian War. Those are the X archives. There's also the archives of the Paris police and the regions. There's the regional archives. There's the Vincennes archives for the military services. There are the audio visual archives, which are at the Ivry Fort. I've worked a lot on those archives. There are about 500,000 photographs taken by the French military during the war. In fact, Marie Cheminot wrote a doctorate under my direction on the photographic archives, which are enormous, of the French military during the Algerian War. So you see, it's an ocean. It's an ocean in such a way that when you talk abstractly about the archives, you have to know what you're going looking for. You can't just abstractly say, okay, here's the archives, we're going to find secrets. No, you have to define first, of course, what you mean by to reveal, to unveil, to write about. You need subjects of study. That's fundamental. That's the first thing. The second thing that I want to say is that the state archives, because we're talking about state archives ultimately, these do not carry all the histories, the stories, thankfully, because if historians only wrote from state archives, they wouldn't write much. You know, in my book, I cite the great French historian who helped me a lot, Arlette Farge. She wrote very beautiful books. One of them is called The Taste for Archives. It's a great classic of French historiography in terms of archive. What Arlette Farge says is that you can't expect everything from state archives. You have to make the silences of the archives speak through witnesses, through participants, through the press, through landscapes, et cetera, et cetera. So for example, in my work, when I did the biographical dictionary of 600 Algerian nationalist activists, which I did alone, a big part of those archives are oral archives. In other words, people, participants whom I met, Mohamed Arbi, but also Alid Ahoun, all the great heads of nationalism who helped me with this dictionary. The witness statements of living participants in times of cataclysms, revolutions, wars, catastrophes, these are fundamental things. We don't talk about that. When we talk about archives, about very severe historical events, we have to create data banks of oral archives. That's one of my recommendations, is to create oral archives. Otherwise, the participants will disappear. That's fundamental. And it's a second point that needs to be underlined regarding archives. A third point regarding archives is the question of access to archives. What historians want, notably the French ones, and also Algerian ones recently, is to have the possibility to access archives, including the ones that are national secrets. Recently, they had been closed since 1954. Some historians were able to look at some, but it was very complicated because they would only be released little by little. You could look at one document at a time. It took a wild amount of time. So what historians were demanding is a greater amount of fluidity, and especially that the secret, quote unquote, be removed to go after the Algerian War and not before. That's what the President of Republic decided following one of my recommendations. The date after which things are secret is no longer 1954, but 1970. This is a major step forward. But there remain concerns, worries, concerns about whether these archives will be redacted in part. We need to move forward and see what will happen once we can access post-1954 archives, and we'll see. But I must say that state archives do not reveal everything of, for instance, summary executions, torture, etc. That is not true. If we expect state archives to give us spectacular revelations, we'll probably be very disappointed. I discovered this when I made a documentary called The Algerian Years. To do that, I interviewed two French aviators who told me, you can see the documentary on my site, they explain how they used napalm in Algeria in 1959. This is not in the archives. It's not written down. Regarding extra legal executions, that's not in the archives. So you have to mix the sources of information when you're writing history. But access to archives is fundamental. That's what the Algerian historians have been reminding us of recently. They are demanding greater access to the archives, and it's very difficult to access the archives when you're in Algeria because there's the problem of visas, and that's how you're right to mention it, and that's why I proposed a multiple entry visa that allows back and forth for Algerian researchers. But there's a last question, which is returning archives, which I also touch on in my report. So many archives remained in Algeria that France left in Algeria. Administrative archives regarding landscaping, which I saw in Constantine. So there are archives, but there's not all the archives. So what I mentioned in my report, recommended, is to reactivate a commission for returning archives. That's the kind of thing you can discuss. Why not? But you also have to understand that now these archives for over a half a century, for 60 years now, have existed. We also need, how an Algerian historian has also suggested this, we need to create a general heritage. We need to build a common archive that everyone could access. This is a possibility that I also mentioned in the report, that create an inventory so that we could have a common archive that everyone could access. So you see, when you talk about archives, there are different levels. There's the problem of access, secret, fluidity, restituting archives, etc. But it's a huge problem. One has to really tackle it. One really has to deal with it. Excellent. Another aspect, you were talking about napalm. I have the impression that another aspect of the history of the Algerian War and the relationship between France and Algeria that not many people know, but is getting better known, but little known to the public, that's the question of nuclear tests. And your report focuses on this. France carried out several nuclear tests in the southwest of the Algerian Sahara, and this continued even after Algerian independence until 1966. What does your report recommend regarding the legacy of these nuclear tests, and in particular, the question of decontaminating the sites, as well as indemnifying the victims, because many Algerians suffered cancer. And this is an issue that can continue for generations after generations. Some of their children have suffered from this. First, the nuclear question has to be revealed to the French public, because people are convinced that nuclear tests primarily took place in Polynesia. In French society, people didn't really know that there were 17 nuclear tests in Algeria. That needs to be revealed to start with. That's a demand of an association for a long time now, that this question be brought to the public. So that's what I did in the report, because I had received the representatives of the associations and organizations working on this question and that shared information with me. Second thing that needs to be said is that naturally, to access the archives on nuclear tests is to not, it doesn't mean revealing how you build the nuclear bomb. You know, this is not something that needs to be a national defense secret. That's not the question, no. The question is, where were these nuclear tests carried out, so that we can figure out the perimeter of the populations concerned. So the question of the maps of nuclear tests, which is a little bit what France did when it gave maps of the minefields on borders, which affected many, many people. On the L'île Maurice, many people, thousands of people were hurt by this, and thousands of mines were placed along this border. So France provided the map of these mines. That's fundamental for demining. 60 years later, I think that we need to know exactly, specifically, where these nuclear tests were carried out, so we can identify what populations were concerned. And why not consider reparations for the populations affected? This is also in my report. So this is a second aspect, which is a very important one. There's a third aspect, which is a very delicate one, which is, as you've mentioned, these nuclear tests continued after Algerian independence, i.e. from 1962 to 1966. In other words, for more than 4 years. That poses the problem of the secret clauses of the Evian agreements, which were revealed by journalistic work in the Nouvel Observateur in the 1980s. This was a discovery that there were secret clauses in the Evian agreements, but this would also mean having access to two archives, the French archives on the nuclear question, but also the Algerian, in order to really be able to delimit the perimeter and the number of people affected for indemnization. So indeed, your report is quite clear on that question. I think it has the merit of drawing attention to a subject that is little known to the general audience. Another issue that is better known, we've received a certain number of questions, and do continue to send them to us. We're going to get to them. I may have a last question before we turn to the audience. It's the fate of the harkis, who have been spoken of more and more in the last 22 years, but which remains a rather problematic issue in the relationship between France and Algeria. Your report focuses on the question of the harkis, the troops that were mobilized by France, the local troops mobilized by France during the Algerian War. I think there's some uncertainty as to the total number of people affected, but it seems that 15 to 20,000 harkis were relocated to France in 1962. More than 60,000 were massacred in Algeria. What are the demands of the harki community today? What do you think that the harkis can expect both from France on one side? What could they also expect from the Algerian government? So the question of the harki, it must be said, first and foremost, that it is a French question. The harkis belong to the French military world. There are different kinds of harkis. I won't go into the details between those who simply carried a rifle, or at the other extreme, those who were those who volunteered for commandos and did a great deal of damage. So there's kind of a large spectrum of these colonial troops, also because there was a tradition in the French army that was very old. This started very early, starting with the First World War, the Second World War. There were many soldiers, not just harkis. And then there were people who voluntarily joined the French army and went to fight in Indochina during the Indochina War. So this is a French military tradition that goes way back, not just in Algeria, in Morocco with the Senegalese tirailleurs also with various ethnic populations that were involved in this colonial tradition. This is a very French aspect of colonial history, fundamentally. So in this question, there is the problem that has been raised for a very long time of French responsibility in abandoning harkis. In other words, there was this fear, I don't know exactly, this needs to be analyzed, but there's this fear that these colonial troops might one day turn against France, a kind of fantasy that existed. And that led to a tragedy. And in terms of the numbers, there are more harkis than what you said. 30,000 harkis with their families, so 80,000 were brought across the Mediterranean. Thanks to French officers, a certain number of them disobeyed their country's orders and brought entire families of harkis back with them. And in arriving in France, these people were stuck in internment camps. They faced an impossibility to truly socialize within French society, which was an extraordinary thing, which means that Algerian immigrants in France, many of whom supported Algerian independence, these people were far better integrated in French society from the 50s to the 80s. Their children were put in schools and suburbs and cities, etc. But this did not happen with harki children. This is an incredible paradox, which is that there was this kind of spatial ghettoization, a very intense one, of this community, which found itself locked up for 20 or 30 years and then freed itself in the 1980s and 1990s with a demand which was to be recognized. There's a problem of recognition in relation to this history. There's always a question of recognition. Things need to be said clearly. Things need to be named. What happened to them? So in terms of responsibility, French responsibility and harki demands, France must recognize this abandoning. And I nearly said, in quotes, this betrayal, because they joined French forces. This is a very strong demand on the part of the children and grandchildren of these communities. there's also the demand to move freely between Algeria and France. But to be very honest and very objective regarding this question, it's true that there are a lot of former Harkis and their children who went back to Algeria, who've gone back and forth. Very few people are forbidden to go to Algeria, but it's a question of principle. It's a question of principle demanded by the Harki communities for free movement without suspicions. So there's a double demand, actually, of recognition and free circulation. That's the demand that structures the community, which must, as I see it, and this is a personal point of view, which should be structured more on an ideological, cultural level. There are many associations and organizations of children and grandchildren, because when we talk about Harkis, it often means that children, but the children today are 60s. The children of immigrants and colonial troops and Harkis, they're 60 today. So these people are veterans in terms of memorial questions and demands. But the real question for all these groups is the grandchildren, because now with the history of the Algerian War, we've reached the third generation. I'm not talking about Algerian immigrants in France who were in France for 4 or 5 generations. The children of the war were now at the third generation, the grandchildren of Pied Noir, the grandchildren of Harki, and they're looking for their roots. Because there was this delay that I spoke about, and now they're discovering it. So when I'm changing my register now, but when the president of the Republic recognizes France's responsibility for the assassination of Ali Boumengeri, the people he received were the grandchildren of Ali Boumengeri. He spoke to them for an hour and a half. This was a very important meeting. These are people who are between 32 and 39 years old, who are now in French society, who grew up in French society, knowing more or less this history, but in a chaotic way. So the question of making the truth known around this history is a central claim. It is an extremely important demand. Coming, again, I insist upon this, the grandchildren. So I insist on the generational issue. Since there was no transmission through school books or political acts, so there's this kind of marginalization of identities and communities. Through political acts and history, we need to reestablish things to avoid these memorial separations, which is a dangerous question. I wrote a book about it, I think 2 or 3 years ago, called Dangerous Memory. It's a dialogue I had with a French writer called Alexis Génie, who did a book called The French Art of War. And together we talked about the problem of the return of memory, but not in a positive sense, but the return of memories that create danger. It's this paradox about memory. I think you know it. You've worked a lot about this question. You've written a very important book about this question. This is the paradox of the importance of memory, the essence of memory. You need memory, but you need to be careful not to become a prisoner of it. So these are the kind of contradictions that can also happen with the children and grandchildren of Harkis. Thank you. We've just seen a photo of this encounter, this meeting, which must have been very moving, between the grandchildren of Ali Boumengeri and President Macron. We've received many questions. I'm going to try to select a few. We received one from Hamid Herrier, who asks you, nearly 2 centuries after colonization and 60 years after the independence of Algeria, why is this split, this divorce, why does it continue to be so poorly accepted And when can we hope for a return to serene relations between these two countries while accepting this shared history? And what Mr. Herieff says reminds me of the expression of a historian who asked for an appeased memory, which reminds me of what you said about the dangerous memory. So you've filed this report, and with the reactions to this report, can you imagine an appeased memory, a peaceful memory, and what would be the conditions for it? I don't know if I can see the memories being appeased. We can all hope for it. We can work on it, because there are some people in France who are not at all working on that and who are maintaining the war of memories like a kind of business. It's what I call their political business, what keeps them going. And the last thing they want to do is talk about reconciliation. You know, there have been very violent reactions to the report, notably from the very powerful French extreme right, very powerful in the political field in France today. The extreme right received 10 million votes in the second round of the French presidential election. That's considerable. On French television, there are French newspapers, there are polemicists who appear and do not want to recognize this historical reality. So it is very delicate and very difficult work. To answer your question, what can be the paths, the ways, the means actually to attempt to appease? Earlier we talked about archives. I won't return to that. There are other things that we need to find bridges in. In my report, for instance, I proposed building a museum for the history of France and Algeria. As your viewer on the internet mentioned, this history lasted 2 centuries. It's colossal. And within that, there were massacres, there were histories, including histories against humanity within the colonial conquest. But there wasn't only that. That's the difficulty. There were also mixes, hybridizations, cross-cultural experience of the French language. There was the reutilization by Algerians to turn them against colonial French. I consider myself as responsible of French Algerian and French Algerian history in writing my work. And I've talked to many people, and all of these people say that they never fought against Republican France, they fought against colonialism, which means that these nationalists, these people who fought for independence, were in this space that was opened in a sense by the French Revolution. You just have to read what they wrote to see that. And of course, in France, there were people who refused the colonial system. It wasn't just a single bloc for a century and a half. During the Algerian War, there were, of course, Pierre Vidal-Naquet, François Marillac, great French writer, who wrote first an article against torture in L'Express that was called The Question, which was then carried on by Henri Alleg in 58. Gisèle Halimi, a woman who defended French militants Algerian militants and Algerian women militants. This is important to know because this history did not take place in a radical separation of one bloc against the other. There were passages, there were people who hoped for another Algeria, to see history differently. So consequently, we need to think about a space in which we can return these memories, return that history. I propose to pick up this project in the city of Montpellier, which was planned for in Montpellier and was then interrupted. The mayor at the time interrupted it. I said we have to pick up that project again and maybe we could do it again. Second aspect, a transversal aspect of path, of passage. There's the question of immigration in France. several million people in France, children of these people, their descendants, are now in France. It's very important to create a cultural space that is mixed, that can carry this history of migratory passage between France and Algeria, because it's also to create history. That's what immigration is. It's the possibility for exchanges, stories, separate and shared histories. That's the whole problem of colonial history, is these separate and shared histories. Histories that are of oppression and domination and that are shared and common. That is what needs to be restituted. That's what's complicated. And that is the task of historians and not memorialists, because memorialists are locked into a single narrative of a participant, whereas historians try to bring together and to find passages. So this is an important thing to work on, with dates for commemoration, important dates. I take these two examples of the museum in Montpellier. We talked about archives, of the migratory question. But for me, the most important was, nonetheless, as a kind of lead-in to it, the recognition by France of the assassination of Ali Boumendjed, because through one character, that reveals an entire aspect of history. It's the first time that a French head of state recognizes something at that level. It's very important. It allows us to reveal, to show, to see what this history was, and then we can move forward behind that. But first, we needed to recognize the thing before we could open up paths. So I don't have a definitive answer. These are questions, these are approaches to questions. Your report has other aspects which we could talk about, numerous aspects which we could talk about. One concerns the importance of culture and audiovisual arts. So we have two questions about this. One is from Megan Emery, who asks, what role did contemporary literature, what role can contemporary literature play in moving relations between France and Algeria forward? We have a question from Jonathan Lewis, also about the role of fictional works that contest the silence around the Algerian War. How can these works interact with the historian's work? You were right to ask about literature, because that's what was surprising to me in the reception to my report. Those who supported me, unlike some historians, were the writers. I received messages from Yasmina Hadra, Kamel Daoud, and others who supported me. And this touched me a great deal, because they're faced, Kamel Daoud wrote an article, which was published in English recently about this question. They're faced with these problems of this complicated and tragic history, and they tackle it through literature. You know, what affected me a great deal in my work as a historian is literature. When I was working in the 80s, Rachid Doumi wrote two books, Tombeza and another one. And these were terribly moving revelations to me, because they went deep into the core, the guts of Algerian society at the time. It was a huge shock to me. And that encourages historical researchers to go further. So literature plays the role of an avant-garde that is an extraordinary. Today, there are other historians dealing with these questions. Women, many of them. Alice Zeniter, The Art of Losing. I don't remember the exact titles of her novel. There was the Tailleur de Rélisane. There are many volumes, many written by women, but I didn't prepare this answer, so I don't have the exact titles in my mind. But there are some 10 novels this year, between this year and last year, that came out and deal with this history. This is extraordinary. So it's literature that is carrying on its shoulders through fiction this complex and tragic history. There's film as well. Of course, unfortunately, there's epidemic. We all know about COVID, but there are 3 films about Algeria were supposed to come out, which I've seen, which is a privilege I have. I've had this privilege because they haven't come out in theaters yet. There's a film adapted from a novel by Laurent Mauvignier, starring Gérard Depardieu and Jean-Pierre Daroussin, called Des Hommes, of Men, a story about an old man, Depardieu, remembering scenes of torture and execution, who's being driven mad by the memory. This film hasn't come out, unfortunately. A second film, very beautiful. It's about Yveton, who was an activist who was guillotined. It's a film played by Vincent Lacoste, a young French actor, a very promising one. And it's the story of Yveton, adapted from a novel that received the Goncourt Prize for high schools, called Of Our Wounded Brothers, a third film, a magnificent one, a film by Mai Wen, who is a French actress who made a film called DNA, which also hasn't come out, but I've seen it. It tells her own story, the discovery of her Algerian identity when her father died in France. And through the memory of her father, she tells this whole story. It's a film I found extraordinary. Its sensitivity, its emotion, 3 films. You see, these, unfortunately, they didn't come out, but these films bear witness to the power of fiction, whether it's audiovisual or literary, carrying this fascinating history. I think we're trying to put some of these references in the chat. I'd like to close perhaps with a political question, which comes to us from Mioud Ben Zerga. Do you think that with a democratic and democratically elected Algerian regime, reconciliation and normalization of French-Algerian relations would be easier? That's a huge question, a very political one. And I am not a political participant. I'm just trying to encourage this reconciliation. I nearly want to say, both in relation to the Algerian political powers in place, but also the movement that has been built in Algeria for the last 2 years that is posing political questions. There's a desire for history, in the youth movement in Algeria. The youth movement is reappropriating history in Algeria through portraits, narratives, things that were secret and were unknown. There's pluralities of history. There are national movements because there are great pluralities of history in Algeria. There's the FLN memoirs, there's the memoirs of the Berberist current in Algeria, which is very important. There's the reformist religious formant. There's the communist movement that was carried by the communist Algerian movement. So there are pluralities of memories, of programs, of characters that need to be restituted. And that plurality, for me, must accompany the process of political democracy. Memorial plurality is very important, and that is the work of the people in the field and of historians. I can't replace all these movements. I can't take their place, but I hope that we will reach this reconciliation. Thank you. It remains to me to thank you, Benjamin Stora, for this fascinating conversation, which you allowed us to cross the years of the memory of the Algerian conflict and the tense and complex relationship between France and Algeria. And you've also allowed us to glimpse some of the bridges that allow us to better understand both the divergences between these memories, because you do say you don't recommend the idea of a single shared memory, but in a certain way, you've showed us how these divergent memories can have points of intersection on which we can build, if not an appeased memory, at least the potential for a reconciled memory. You have given us a great amount of leads. I think we've learned a lot. And there's also, finally, the place occupied by the relationship between France and Algeria in this post-colonial memorial space that is increasingly complex, and that may once again offer us some models for how to think about the rather complex relationship between memory and history in the context of the French context and beyond. So I want to thank you for all the ideas that you've shared today. I want to remind our listeners that the report is available, I think, and it's now a book published by De Noël, published by Albin Michel, sorry. It will be translated in Arabic and English. And we had a great deal of questions. We were unfortunately unable to deal with all of them, but I think you gave us a lot of material to think with. Thank you, Benjamin Stora. Thank you to my colleagues from the French department at the Columbia University, as well as the Maison Française, as well as all our colleagues who participated in making this happen. Thank you. Good evening.